The evening sun was setting over Portland's skyline as Officer James Barrett sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel. His day had been a mess from the start. His coffee maker broke, his ex-wife had called about late alimony payments, and his supervisor had chewed him out over incomplete paperwork. The frustration had been building up like a pressure cooker, and he was just looking for an excuse to blow off steam. That's when he spotted the silver Honda Civic rolling through the stop sign at Oak and 23rd Street. Under normal circumstances, it might have warranted just a warning, but Barrett was far from his normal self today. He flipped on his lights and sirens, watching with grim satisfaction as the Honda pulled over to the curb. The driver was a young Asian-American woman in her early 20s, dressed in business casual attire with a university lanyard hanging from her rearview mirror. She was clearly nervous, her hands visibly shaking as she turned down her car's radio and reached for her documents before Barrett even approached her window. Through his rearview mirror, Barrett noticed a few pedestrians slowing down to watch the scene unfold. Some had already pulled out their phones, a sight that only added to his irritation. Ever since those police accountability protests last summer, it seemed like everyone wanted to play citizen journalist. As he approached the Honda, Barrett deliberately took his time, making each step heavy and purposeful. He could see the young woman anxiously checking her mirrors, probably wondering what was taking so long. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the street, and the first street lights were flickering to life. License and registration, he barked before she could even roll her window all the way down. The young woman jumped slightly at his tone, but quickly composed herself. "Yes, officer," she replied politely, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I have my license right here, but I might need a moment to find my insurance card. I recently switched carriers and—" "I didn't ask for your life story," Barrett cut her off sharply. "Just get me what I asked for." He watched as she fumbled through her glove compartment, papers rustling as she searched for the right documents. The growing crowd of onlookers was making Barrett increasingly agitated. He could hear murmurs and see more phones being raised. Some guy in a business suit had stopped completely, pretending to tie his shoe while obviously recording the interaction. "Officer," the young woman started again, her voice still remarkably composed. "I can pull up my insurance information on my phone if that would." "Step out of the vehicle," Barrett demanded suddenly, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. The young woman's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. "I'm sorry, but may I ask why? I was just trying to—" "I said step out of the vehicle." Barrett's voice rose sharply, echoing off the nearby buildings. "When an officer gives you an order, you comply immediately." Little did Barrett know that this routine traffic stop was about to become the biggest mistake of his career. The young woman he was currently intimidating wasn't just any college student, and the video being recorded by those bystanders would soon be evidence in a case that would shake the entire police department to its core. What happened in the next few minutes would not only change Barrett's life forever, but would also spark a conversation about police accountability that would reach far beyond the streets of Portland. The young woman's identity, and more importantly, her father's position, would turn this seemingly minor traffic stop into a turning point for the entire community. As the tension continued to build on that quiet street corner, none of the participants realized they were about to become part of a story that would make headlines across the country and force an entire police department to confront its darkest aspects. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest incidents, and that justice can come from the most unexpected places. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger now, their phones recording every moment of the escalating situation. Officer Barrett's face had turned a deep shade of red, his patience wearing thinner with each passing second. The young woman was still sitting in her car, her hands now clearly visible on the steering wheel, trying her best to remain calm despite the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. "I said get out of the car," Barrett shouted again, this time reaching for her door handle. The young woman flinched but maintained her composure, her voice remarkably steady as she spoke. "Officer, I understand you want me to step out, but could you please tell me what I've done wrong? I'm happy to cooperate, You don't get to ask questions here." Barrett's voice boomed across the street, causing several bystanders to jump. A middle-aged woman in a business suit had joined the crowd, her face showing clear concern as she dialed a number on her phone. Barrett's body camera was recording everything: his aggressive stance, the threatening tone in his voice, and most importantly, the young woman's consistent politeness and compliance. Later, when the footage would be reviewed, it would paint a damning picture of an officer completely losing control over a minor traffic violation. The evening air had grown cooler, and the streetlights cast harsh shadows across the scene. A gentle breeze carried the sounds of distant traffic and the murmurs of the growing crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "Hey, leave her alone," which only served to further agitate Barrett. His hand was still resting on his weapon as he moved closer to the car, his body language becoming more threatening with each step. The young woman's eyes darted between Barrett's face and his hand on the gun, her calm exterior finally beginning to crack under the pressure. "Officer," she tried one more time, her voice slightly trembling now, "my father is." "I don't care who your father is," Barrett snapped, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Last warning, get out of the car now." A couple of teenagers on bikes had stopped to watch, their faces reflecting the tension in the air. One of them whispered to the other, "This isn't right, man. She didn't do anything." Barrett's supervisor would later note that this was the moment when everything could have been de-escalated. A simple explanation, a moment of patience, or even just a deep breath might have changed the entire course of events. Instead, Barrett chose to let his anger and frustration guide his actions. The body camera footage would show Barrett's next moves in perfect clarity. How he yanked the car door open with unnecessary force, how his face contorted with rage when the young woman's seatbelt delayed her exit, how he reached in to grab her arm before she could even unbuckle herself. What Barrett didn't notice was a city bus stopping nearby, its passengers pressing against the windows to witness the scene. Among them was an off-duty police officer who immediately recognized that things were spiraling out of control. He quickly pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hoped he wouldn't need to use. The young woman was still trying to explain something about her father, about making a phone call, about her rights. But Barrett wasn't listening anymore. His day of frustrations, his personal problems, and his unchecked anger had created a perfect storm of poor judgment and abuse of power. The crowd had grown silent now, the only sounds being Barrett's sharp commands and the click of phone cameras. The air was thick with tension as everyone watched, wondering how this situation could possibly end well. Nobody knew yet that this moment would soon become a turning point for police accountability in their city. As the sun continued to set over Portland, casting long shadows across the scene, Barrett was about to make a decision that would not only end his career, but would also spark a movement for change that would ripple through police departments across the country. The identity of the young woman's father was still unknown to him, but in just a few hours, that revelation would make him wish he never put on his badge that morning. What happened next would be replayed hundreds of times on news channels and social media. The evening had grown darker, with street lamps casting harsh light over the scene as Officer Barrett forcefully pulled the young woman from her car. His body camera captured every moment, including her repeated attempts to explain herself. "Please, officer, just let me call my father," she pleaded, her voice shaking but still maintaining remarkable composure. "He's hands behind your back," Barrett interrupted, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. The growing crowd of onlookers gasped as he roughly spun her around, the young woman stumbling slightly in her modest heels. A nearby shop owner had stepped outside, holding his phone steady as he recorded. "Hey, she's not resisting," he called out, his voice joining the chorus of concerned witnesses. Barrett shot him a threatening glare, but the shop owner stood his ground, continuing to record. The young woman winced as the handcuffs clicked too tight around her wrists. Her university ID card fell from her pocket, skittering across the sidewalk. A kind-faced elderly woman picked it up, her hands trembling with anger at what she was witnessing. "Officer, please," the young woman tried one final time. "You're making a huge mistake." "My father." "I told you to be quiet," Barrett snapped, pushing her against the car with unnecessary force. The thud of her shoulder hitting the vehicle made several onlookers cry out in protest. The off-duty officer who had been watching from the bus had finally made his way through the crowd. "Barrett," he called out, recognizing his colleague, "maybe you should take a step back and—" But Barrett was too far gone in his power trip to listen to reason. His face was red with anger, his breathing heavy as he started reciting charges: resisting arrest, failure to comply with an officer's commands, disorderly conduct. The young woman's eyes were wet with tears now, but she held her head high, dignity intact despite the humiliation. A passing nurse had stopped to observe her condition, noting the way she favored her left wrist, where the handcuffs dug in too tightly. The crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people, their phones creating a sea of glowing screens in the growing darkness. Someone had started a live stream, capturing everything in real time. The comments were flooding in, with viewers expressing their outrage at the obvious abuse of power they were witnessing. "I want to file a formal complaint," the young woman stated clearly, her voice carrying across the now quiet street. "And I want to call my father. It's my right." Barrett laughed dismissively, but the off-duty officer's face had grown pale. He had just received a text message that made him realize exactly who this young woman was, and more importantly, who her father was. He stepped forward again, more urgently this time. "Barrett, listen to me, you really need to." But it was too late. Barrett was already reading the young woman her rights, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He hadn't noticed how the crowd's phones were now being joined by news cameras, or how police cars were starting to arrive from all directions, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. The young woman stood calmly despite her discomfort, as if she knew something Barrett didn't. A slight smile had formed on her lips, not one of happiness but of certainty. She knew that within the next hour, her father would be receiving multiple calls about this incident, and Officer Barrett's career would effectively be over. As Barrett moved to put her in the back of his patrol car, a senior officer finally arrived on the scene. He took one look at the young woman, recognition dawning on his face, and immediately began barking orders to release her. But the damage was already done. The videos were uploaded, the witnesses had their statements ready, and the wheels of justice had begun to turn. The night air had grown chilly, but nobody in the crowd moved to leave. They all sensed that they were witnessing something important, a moment that would soon become a catalyst for change in their community. What started as a simple traffic stop had evolved into an incident that would spark conversations about police reform across the entire country. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as news of the incident spread like wildfire. Officer Barrett sat at his desk, still fuming about the traffic stop, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. His computer screen showed 5 missed calls from his supervisor, but he was too busy filling out his version of the arrest report to notice. Down the hall, the police chief's office had erupted into chaos. The chief's face had drained of all color as he watched the viral videos flooding social media. His phone hadn't stopped ringing for the past hour, and the most recent call had confirmed his worst fears. The young woman Barrett had roughed up was the daughter of federal Judge Chen, the newly appointed judicial powerhouse known for his unwavering stance on police accountability. "Get Barrett in here now." The chief's voice boomed through the precinct. Officers scrambled to comply, their faces a mix of relief that it wasn't them and concern for what was about to unfold. Meanwhile, across town in the federal courthouse, Judge Chen was reviewing the footage on his tablet, his expression unreadable. His colleagues watched as he calmly set down the device and straightened his tie. The only sign of his anger was a slight tremor in his hands as he picked up his phone to make a call. Back at the station, Barrett was still obstinately defending his actions to a group of uncomfortable-looking fellow officers. "She was resisting," he insisted, gesturing wildly. "You should have seen how she—" "Officer Barrett." The chief's voice cut through the room like a knife. "My office, now." The walk to the chief's office felt like the longest of Barrett's life. Officers turned away as he passed, suddenly very interested in their paperwork. Through the glass walls, he could see several high-ranking officials gathered inside, their faces grave. As Barrett entered the office, the chief motioned for him to sit down. On the desk lay printed screenshots from the viral videos and a tablet playing the body camera footage on loop. Barrett's stomach began to sink as he realized just how many people had witnessed his actions. "Do you know who that young woman was?" the chief asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Barrett shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Some college student," Barrett shrugged, though his confidence was beginning to crack. She was disrespecting. "That some college student," the chief interrupted, "is Judge Chen's daughter. Federal Judge Chen." the same Judge Chen who's heading the Special Commission on Police Accountability in our department. The color drained from Barrett's face as the implications hit him. Judge Chen wasn't just any federal judge. He was a legend in legal circles, known for his unwavering commitment to justice and his particular interest in cases involving police misconduct. But she never said, Barrett stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. She tried to tell you, another officer spoke up, playing a clip from the body camera footage. Multiple times, you just wouldn't listen. The chief's phone buzzed again, another call from the mayor's office. Outside, news fans were beginning to gather in the parking lot. Social media was exploding with the story, and the hashtag Judge's daughter was already trending nationwide. The judge is on his way here, the chief said, his voice heavy with resignation, not as a father, but in his official capacity. And Barrett? He's bringing the entire police oversight committee with him. Barrett slumped in his chair as reality crashed down around him. His mind raced back to every moment of that traffic stop, every harsh word, every aggressive action, every ignored plea. All of it captured on video, all of it witnessed by dozens, and all of it about to be scrutinized by one of the most powerful judges in the state. Through the station windows, the lights of arriving news vans painted the walls in flashing colors. Officers hurried to close blinds and secure doors as reporters began gathering outside. In the break room, a TV showed the story breaking on local news. Barrett's face splashed across the screen alongside Judge Chen's impressive legal history. The chief's phone buzzed one final time, a message that made him stand up straight. Judge Chen is here, he announced, straightening his uniform. And Barrett? He's not alone. The entire state's police oversight committee is with him. As footsteps approached the office, Barrett realized that this wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. His actions had just triggered what would become one of the most significant investigations into police conduct their city had ever seen. The morning sun had barely risen over the city when the story exploded across every major news network. The police station's parking lot looked like a media circus, with news vans parked bumper to bumper and reporters doing live broadcasts from every available corner. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers huddled around desktop monitors, watching as clips from the incident played on repeat across different news channels. The young woman's bruised wrist had been photographed at the hospital, and those images were now being shared alongside Barrett's disciplinary record, a record that, until now, had been carefully hidden from public view. "Look at this," one officer whispered, pointing to his computer screen. An old complaint against Barrett from 2 years ago had resurfaced, another case of excessive force that had been quietly swept under the rug. Then another. And another. The dam of silence was breaking, and years of covered-up misconduct were flowing into public view. The chief hadn't slept all night, his office light burning steady through the darkness. Empty coffee cups littered his desk as he prepared for the upcoming press conference. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from the mayor's office, each one more urgent than the last. "Sir," his secretary called from the doorway, "Judge Chen's office just sent over the official notice. They're launching a full investigation into the department's handling of previous complaints against Officer Barrett." In the break room, younger officers watched the morning news with growing concern. The reporter was interviewing witnesses from the scene, including the shop owner who had recorded everything. His video had gone viral overnight, already reaching millions of views. He grabbed her like she was nothing, the shop owner explained on screen, his voice still shaking with anger. "We all saw it. We all recorded it. This time, they can't say it didn't happen." Meanwhile, the hospital had become another media hotspot. The young woman had been treated and released, but photos of her injuries had made their way to the press. The image of her hospital bracelet next to her father's judicial badge had become a powerful symbol, shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Back at the station, internal affairs investigators arrived in a convoy of unmarked cars. They moved through the building like silent shadows, collecting files, copying hard drives, and conducting interviews. Every officer who had ever worked with Barrett was called in for questioning. "Tell us about September 15th of last year," they asked one rookie officer. "Were you present when Officer Barrett confronted that teenage cyclist?" The truth was spilling out, one interview at a time. Officers who had witnessed Barrett's previous misconduct but stayed quiet were now coming forward, their silence finally broken by the weight of public scrutiny. In the courthouse, Judge Chen sat in his chambers, reviewing case after case. His daughter's incident had opened a door that couldn't be closed, revealing not just one officer's misconduct, but an entire system that had protected him. "Look at these numbers," he said to his colleagues, spreading documents across his desk. 17 complaints in 5 years, all dismissed, all buried. Until now. The police union representatives arrived at the station around noon, their faces grim. They had defended officers in trouble before, but this was different. The public outrage was too strong, the evidence too clear, and the victim's father too powerful. Local community leaders began organizing a peaceful gathering in the park where the incident had occurred. People brought flowers and cards, leaving them at the stop sign where it all began. Among the crowds, previous victims of police misconduct began sharing their own stories, finally feeling heard. The young woman's hospital photos continued to circulate, but alongside them, something else was spreading. Hope. Hope that this time would be different. Hope that real change might finally come to a system that had protected its own for too long. As evening approached, the chief finally emerged for his press conference. Camera lights flashed as he stepped up to the microphone, his face showing the weight of the last 24 hours. Behind him, a screen displayed the department's new commitments to transparency and accountability. Today, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "We face our failures openly. What happened yesterday was not just one officer's mistake. It was a failure of our entire system, and that changes now." The sun set on a city transformed. In just 24 hours, one traffic stop had exposed years of hidden misconduct and sparked a movement for change that would reshape the entire department. And somewhere in the city, a young woman and her father watched the press conference together, knowing that their ordeal might help prevent others from facing the same treatment in the future. The downtown courthouse buzzed with activity as people lined up to attend Barrett's disciplinary hearing. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, but public interest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger as more stories of his past misconduct came to light. Inside the hearing room, every seat was filled. Community members, reporters, and off-duty officers packed the rows, while a sketch artist captured the scene from the corner. Judge Chen had properly recused himself, but his presence was felt throughout the building, his reputation for fairness and accountability hanging over the proceedings like an invisible force. The young woman sat in the front row, her wrist now healed, but her determination stronger than ever. Next to her sat the shop owner who had recorded the incident, along with other witnesses from that evening. They had all given their statements, their words painting a clear picture of what had happened. "The body camera footage speaks for itself," the department prosecutor stated, standing before the review board. On the screen behind her, the video played again. The room fell silent as they watched Barrett's aggressive behavior unfold in high definition. But it wasn't just about one incident anymore. As the hearing progressed, a pattern emerged through testimony after testimony. A middle-aged man described how Barrett had roughed him up during a routine traffic stop last year. A teenage boy recounted being threatened for recording an arrest on his phone. An elderly woman tearfully shared how Barrett had mocked her accent when she tried to report a robbery. These incidents were reported, the prosecutor continued, shuffling through a thick stack of papers. Every single one. But they were buried, dismissed, or ignored. Today, we correct that failure. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. They weren't protesting. Instead, they held signs supporting police reform and accountability. Local news crews interviewed people who had traveled from neighboring cities to show their support. Back inside, Barrett sat stiffly in his chair as his own dashboard camera videos from previous incidents played on the screen. His face grew paler with each new piece of evidence. His union representative had advised him to show remorse, but pride still kept him from admitting his mistakes. "Officer Barrett," one board member asked, "do you understand why your actions were inappropriate?" Barrett shifted in his seat, his arrogance finally cracking under the weight of evidence. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. The young woman's hospital photos appeared on screen next. The bruised wrist, the marks from too tight handcuffs, all documented by emergency room staff. The board members studied the images in silence, their expressions grave. A senior officer took the stand, his voice heavy with regret. "We knew," he admitted. "We knew about his temper, his complaints, his history. We failed our community by not addressing it sooner." During a brief recess, conversations in the hallway centered on change. Officers spoke quietly about the need for better training, while community members shared their hopes for improved police-community relations. Something was shifting in the air. A sense that real transformation was possible. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows as the board prepared to announce their decision. The room fell silent again, cameras ready, pencils poised above notepads. Barrett stared straight ahead, his career hanging by a thread. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the board chairman began, his voice firm, and the clear pattern of misconduct demonstrated through multiple incidents. "This board has reached a unanimous decision." The young woman held her breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her case anymore, it was about every person who had ever faced similar treatment and been ignored. Officer James Barrett's employment with the police department is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, we recommend criminal charges be filed for the excessive use of force and abuse of power. The room erupted in murmurs. Reporters rushed out to break the news, while community members hugged each other, tears in their eyes. Several officers nodded in agreement with the decision, relief visible on their faces. As people filed out of the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of real change in the department. The young woman's ordeal had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for too long, letting in the light of accountability and reform. 6 months after the incident, the police department looked drastically different. The old guard had been replaced by fresh faces, and the walls now displayed posters promoting community engagement and accountability. But the biggest changes weren't visible, they were woven into the very fabric of how the department operated. In a bright conference room, the young woman who had sparked this transformation stood before a group of police recruits. Her story had become part of their mandatory training, but hearing it firsthand left a deeper impression than any textbook could. "I'm not here to make you feel bad," she told them, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here because what happened to me can help prevent similar incidents in the future." The recruits sat up straighter, many taking notes as she described that evening. Among them was a former teacher who had joined the force specifically because of this case, wanting to be part of the positive change. Across town, Judge Chen presided over the newly established Police Oversight Committee. The walls of their meeting room displayed statistics showing dramatic improvements, complaints down by 60%, community trust up by 45%, and officer satisfaction surprisingly improved as well. When officers know they'll be held accountable, a veteran sergeant explained during a community meeting, they actually feel more secure in their jobs. Clear rules and consequences protect everyone. The shop owner who had recorded the original incident had been appointed to a civilian review board. His phone footage was now used in training sessions nationwide, teaching officers how quickly a routine stop could spiral out of control and how to prevent it. At the local university, students packed lecture halls for a new course on community policing. The young woman occasionally guest lectured, sharing her experience not with anger, but with hope for change. Her story had inspired many to pursue careers in law enforcement reform and civil rights law. The police chief's office had undergone its own transformation. Gone were the days of buried complaints and ignored reports. A large screen now displayed real-time body camera feeds, and citizens could track the status of their complaints online. Transparency isn't just a buzzword anymore, the chief explained to a visiting delegation from another city. It's how we rebuild trust, one interaction at a time. Even the spot where the incident occurred had changed. The community had turned it into a small garden, with a bench and a plaque that read, "Where accountability took root." Officers on patrol would often stop there, using it as a reminder of their commitment to serve and protect properly. In the precinct break room, officers gathered for their morning briefing. The tone was different now, more open, more focused on prevention than reaction. They discussed scenarios and solutions, sharing experiences without fear of judgment. "Remember," their supervisor said, pointing to a poster of their new guidelines, "we're here to protect and serve." That means everyone, including those who question our actions. The young woman's father had stepped back from directly overseeing police reform, but his influence remained. The standards he had helped establish were being adopted by departments across the state, creating a ripple effect of positive change. Former Officer Barrett's case had become a cautionary tale in police academies nationwide. But more importantly, it had become a story of transformation, how one incident handled properly could lead to meaningful reform. As the sun set over the city, a new shift of officers headed out on patrol. Their body cameras recorded every interaction, but it wasn't fear of punishment that guided their actions. It was a genuine desire to serve their community better. The young woman stood at her apartment window, watching the city lights come on. Her phone buzzed with another invitation to speak at a police training seminar. She smiled, remembering how her father had always taught her that real change comes from within the system, one person at a time. Outside, a police car rolled to a gentle stop at a traffic light. The officer inside waved at some kids playing basketball, and they waved back without hesitation. This simple interaction, impossible just months ago, showed how far they'd come. In the end, what had started as one officer's brutal act had evolved into something much bigger, a model for police reform that emphasized accountability, transparency, and community trust. The city had shown that change was possible when people worked together, turning a moment of crisis into an opportunity for lasting transformation.